Today's goal is to take a look at Unit 2. Now, Unit 2 and Unit 1 both cover this time frame of 1200 to 1450, difference being the focal point of Unit 2 is networks of exchange. So obviously it's more of an economic focus, whereas the focus of Unit 1 was more on topics related to governance. Now we still are going to go through this thematically. So the first theme is still indeed governance. So obviously, state formation, expansion, decline, how order is maintained, and how governments exercise their power. First concept of governance. We're looking at topic 2.2, and this is the Mongol Empire and the making of the modern world. With governance as it relates to the Mongols, we're looking at this concept of how state building occurs throughout Eurasia over time. We see here Mongol Khanates. The Mongol Empire was so large, we can see the extent of it here, that it eventually was broken up into 4 different Khanates. Now we have the Great Khan, which is essentially Mongolia, Korea, China, Tibet, so East Asia. We have the Golden Horde, which is mainly Russia. We have Ilkhanate. It says, you can see Persia. So we have modern portions of Iran, Iraq, and then parts of Afghanistan. And then we have the Chagatai Khanate, which is more in line with, Central Asia. Additionally, one of the other big ideas of governance is we have West African empires. Namely, we're looking at the Mali Empire. So here we can see the extent of the Mali Empire, including Jenny, which is famous for its mosque. So we know that Islam is gonna, enter the fray. And then Timbuktu, a terminus on the Trans-Saharan route, or the so-called sand roads, but also was an intellectual center. And going hand in hand with the Mali Empire is Mansa Musa, who made his famous pilgrimage to Mecca and passed out so much gold along the way that it depreciated in value. So there are points that we need to understand leaders along with some of these, government structures or empires. Mansa Musa with Mali, just like Chinggis Khan, would go hand in hand with the Mongols. So that's what we have for governance. Next, we look at technology and innovation. Now, with technology, the big thing to understand here is topic 2.4, Trans-Saharan trade routes. All right, so with the Trans-Saharan trade routes, obviously the focus is in the Sahara, but we have elements of Western and North Africa that are interconnected. So we can see Cairo, modern-day Egypt, kind of the northeastern portion of it. And then we have elements of Mali. But when we look at technology, caravans and camel saddles. So the idea here is that we have interregional trade, and the growth of it is encouraged by innovations in existing transportation technologies. So we have these massive caravans, because remember, this journey could take as much as 70 days, and it's hot in a desert, so you can only travel at night. Camels can survive up to 10 days without water in the desert, so they're ideal, but there were different saddles that were innovated for different purposes. Some saddles were meant for when camels needed to make longer journeys. Some were more for heavier or lighter loads, things of that nature. Next, we arrive at humans and the environment. Now remember that 2.3 is all about routes of exchange within the Indian Ocean basin. And the big thing here is that as it pertains to the environment, knowledge of the monsoon winds is going to allow for increased long-distance trade and communication. So here we have summer monsoons versus winter monsoons. In the summer, the monsoon winds would predictably blow northeast, whereas in the winter, we're talking southwest. Once navigators figure this out, goods and services could be moved in a much more predictable way. The other huge environmental factor to consider when we take a look at 2.6 environmental consequences of connectivity. We have diffusion of crops and pathogens with epidemic diseases, including the plague, moving along trade routes. And this is kind of the double-edged sword when we take a look at the fact that with the Mongols and structure, you have protected trade routes, but that allows for diseases to travel more consistently. Now, with the outbreak of the plague, Pagan, this is more southern China. It's kind of isolated, confined to this area. Eventually, it moves up, we can see, to central China, and then maybe more eastern regions, but with protected trade. It goes west, and we think that when the Mongols laid siege to Kaffa, the plague was affecting their men. They would, kind of catapult their men over the walls of Kaffa. The plague spreads because the city kind of empties out, the merchants leave. They go to these new trading centers in Europe, which are starting to grow in population. Perfect place to spread. So it spreads, you can kind of see the routes all throughout Europe, North Africa, even into Arabia, Mecca, Aden, wherever there's a concentration of people and wherever you have protected trade routes, you will see this thing spread. Now with culture, we can think interaction of different ideas. We have religion. Kind of going back to the Mongols, kind of making of the modern world with 2.2, Greco-Islamic medical knowledge transmits to Western Europe. So within the Islamic world, we saw that they preserved ancient medical knowledge. So like Hippocrates, who was, the Greek physician, Galen, who had Roman knowledge, they preserved this, combined it with knowledge that the Persians had come up with, and they continued to push and innovate. So we know that there were medical texts that eventually were translated into Latin. Specifically, some of these texts were famous because they contain knowledge of contagious diseases and how they spread. And these texts also had extensive illustrations and diagrams of surgical instruments, and they were famous for their sections on how to perform surgery. So this is just an example of how knowledge is transmitted from one place to another. Regarding the Indian Ocean, the voyages of Zheng He are a big idea to understand from this time frame. Now remember that the eunuch admiral Zheng He completed his 7 expeditions at the request of the Ming Emperor at the time. His big goal was to demonstrate the might of the Ming, but also to draw different areas into the Chinese tribute system. So we believe, as you can see from the map, we believe that Zheng He's massive fleet of junks, those are the ships that he had, they did reach as far as the eastern horn and the east coast of Africa. But alas, when his final voyage was completed, the new emperor wasn't really too keen on sending ships out. The idea is China is the mighty Middle Kingdom. What are we doing trying to communicate with the rest of the world? Let's internalize. So his ships were left to rot in dry dock. But Zheng He and his fleet is something that does kind of, it goes between units. It's explicitly mentioned in the developments for Unit 2, but there's some spillover into Unit 3 as well, just because the time frame of the Ming goes in between those. Now with cultural consequences of connectivity, that's what 2.5 refers to. We do see that there's a diffusion of scientific technological innovations. And we see two of them right here. So the Chinese developed paper and this formula for something called gunpowder. So we see the formula for gunpowder that's, I say written, but using block printing, it's printed out on paper. So those two technologies are going to diffuse. We also see, and this is the exact wording, as exchange networks intensified, an increasing number of travelers within Afro-Eurasia wrote about their travels. Two of the biggest examples are Marco Polo and then Ibn Battuta. And with the routes of Ibn Battuta, we find that he primarily kept his travels to the Islamic world. And that's something we always need to keep in mind. That's where we go back to this notion of HAP, historical situation, audience, purpose, point of view. The point of view of Ibn Battuta is always that of a Muslim or Islamic traveler. So he primarily stayed within that world, and it definitely shaped his worldview and what he wrote about. Now, with economic systems, obviously with networks of exchange, this is the biggie with this unit. With 2.1, the actual name of the topic is the Silk Roads, so obviously that's going to be a focal point. And we see here that it goes from Chang'an, which is in the, it's the eastern terminus in China, all the way through to Constantinople. Now, keep in mind that with the Silk Roads, we see some examples of powerful new trading cities. Kashgar is one that's explicitly, given as an illustrative example, but it's all about luxury goods. And often, local areas would put production of food on hold for luxury goods because that's what people wanted. And so the locals often suffered as a consequence. The other thing to keep in mind is we see that innovations in previously existing transportation commercial technologies allowed for the growth of interregional trade. In this case, we see the caravanserai, and this example is still standing today in modern-day Iran. Think of these as hotels, places that travelers could stop, rest. There were places for whatever pack animal they happened to be traveling with to get food and shelter. So these would pop up along the Silk Roads. When we take a look at the expansion of empires influencing trade, the Mongols, as they expanded, they drew people into their trade networks. And here's an example of a Mongol passport. If you were an official traveler, because they had a type of post road that was set up, a transportation system. At various stops along the way within the Mongol network, if you present this passport, you can claim a new horse, you get water, food, a place to stay, a place to rest. And of course, when we go to the Indian Ocean trade networks, a lot of the themes that we see with the Silk Roads are repeated within the Indian Ocean. So we see the rise and growth of states, numerous examples of city-states on the Swahili city-states like Mogadishu, Mombasa, Zanzibar. We see Malacca, the Sultanate of Malacca is going to rise. The growth of powerful trading cities, Calicut in what's now southern India, primary example. And here we also see the monsoon winds, back again, more environmental. But this was facilitated, just like with the Silk Roads, this is facilitated by new technologies. Well, I should say old ones that are innovated. The compass being a prime example. Now with social interactions, not a thing. Don't worry about it, at least for this unit. Now, just like with Unit 1, the key theme, the key reasoning process is comparison. So here's a sample prompt. You read through the context sentence, you look at the prompt, take a moment, think about how you would address it if this were indeed an LEQ.